devoted her work to ensuring that future generations of Filipinos will live in enabling environments where our natural resources are used in ways that are sustainable and equitable. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Loren Legarda.
Good morning to all of you, and this Social Good Summit comes at a time when first there's Typhoon Odette threatening Metro Manila and has hit northern Luzon, and second, amidst so much negativity sometimes in our country, I'm glad that Rappler, Maria, and all of you have embarked on something that's positive and hopefully inspiring. And it's not so much us teaching you, but we learning from each other. So I was listening to Secretary Sering from the back earlier, and I understand that Maria had delivered her message as well. I hope that my message today somehow could impact on your lives, and these are the laws that we have crafted in the Senate. So I would like to acknowledge Maria Ressa, CEO of Rappler, and Secretary Sering, and all of those responsible for the Social Good Summit. And I hope that this can continue every year and perhaps more frequently so that this goodness can reverberate throughout the country. Much of this perhaps have been discussed by Lucille, but I will focus on the legislation we have done and perhaps some statistics to prove that the issue of climate change should no longer be questioned, whether it exists or not. We know that climate change has become the greatest humanitarian and development challenge of our time. In fact, I even say that it should be considered as a national security issue. A 4 degrees Celsius world may have seemed impossible if we talk about 20 or 30 years ago. There are many young ones here, and perhaps when you were born, you never expected that the issue of climate change would merit a whole day session, such as our summit today. The World Bank warns that we are in fact nearing a crisis that, if not responded to proactively, will continue to endanger the survival of our generation and the next generations. That's a quote. I can't tell you all the quotes so that I will not be charged with plagiarism, but in my speech, for which you have a copy, I want to make sure, because it's all footnoted, like in a privileged speech. I just want to make sure, okay? Then you, so later on, both hard or soft copy, my quotes are footnoted, okay? Just to be sure. Why are you laughing? I'm usually a very serious person. I have never made my audience laugh. And it wasn't meant to make you laugh, but I'm amused that you're laughing. In 2011, the Philippines was the world's most disaster-hit country. According to the Center for Research on Epidemiology of Disasters, or the CRED, there were 302 disasters from natural hazards worldwide. 33 of them occurred in the Philippines. These disasters from natural hazards cost the Philippines 26 billion pesos in damages and displaced 14 or 15.3 million people. Is the UNDP represented here? I think the UNDP would be able to ascertain these facts. In 2012, the single deadliest disaster in the world was Typhoon Bofa, or as we know it to be, Pablo, which left 1,901 people either dead or missing in the Philippines. And up to now, we are trying to recover from that tragedy that hit Region 11, or the Davao-Comval area. Our country accounted for 12.5 million victims of natural disasters in 2012 alone, or 10.2% of total global disaster victims. Let me just backtrack a little. It's not in the picture, so maybe you should stop. Way back in 2009, before the Climate Change Act was enacted, which I filed in 2007, Ondoy happened. Both good and bad. Bad that it happened, but good in a way that people became more sensitized and more aware towards climate change and disaster risk reduction. But why am I mentioning Ondoy? Because Ondoy, the adverse impact, economic impact of Ondoy was 2.7% of our GDP, or according to the UNDP, $4 billion US dollars, which I don't think the government or through donors could have actually come up with such funds. So we ask, what happens if we do not pay for the cost of reconstruction or rehabilitation? Habagat of 2 years ago, walang bagyo nun in Central Luzon. You will recall, sabi nila, inabot ng siyam-siyam. That is a saying ng ating matatanda. Pag ulan ng ulan, wala naman bagyo, inaabot na ito ng siyam-siyam. Habagat was 0.8% of GDP. That was the adverse impact. So we are actually able to see the negative effect of all these natural hazards when we are not prepared. Evidence from the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Special Report on Extreme Events, suggests that climate change has changed the magnitude and the frequency of some extreme weather and climate events. We're all aware that typhoons are normal occurrences in a tropical country like the Philippines, with some 20 heading our way every year. But lately, the occurrence of destructive torrential rains has been increasing even with the absence of typhoons, as what I mentioned, Habagat and many more. As an archipelago, 70% of our cities and municipalities in the country are in coastal areas. And as a 2013 World Bank report revealed, 74% of the country's population is vulnerable to the impact of natural hazards. These extreme events we are experiencing caused by the warming climate threatens our basic human rights, our right to food, our right to potable water, our right to decent, affordable shelter, and even our right to life itself. It is this human face of climate change that I would like to bring to your attention today. Because many years, in my first term in 98, when I would speak of the environment and climate change, and people would say, tama na yan, hindi maintindihan ng tao yan, hindi gut issue yan, palitan mo na ang iyong advokasya, etc. But I thought that in due time, people would understand that it really is an all-encompassing and gut issue. And I thought that now I would just simplify it on the impact of climate change to various sectors. So climate change actually threatens our agricultural productivity and food security that was mentioned by Lucille. From 1970 to 1990, maybe I have to update these figures, typhoons, floods, and droughts resulted in an 82.4% loss to total Philippine rice production. With continued climate change, crop yield potential is estimated to decline by 19% in Asia, and rice yield in the Philippines by as much as 75% towards the end of a century. Climate change, of course, also threatens public health. A study by the World Health Organization revealed that the most apparent effect of climate change in our country was a sudden increase in dengue, malaria, typhoid cases in 1998, but much more now, when the Philippines experienced at the time El Nino, but now incessant rains. In 1998, there were 40,000 dengue cases nationwide, 1,200 cholera cases, 1,000 typhoid. A decade later, in 2008, the Department of Health again noted the increasing number of dengue, malaria, cholera, and typhoid cases that could be attributed to global warming or changes in climate. Climate change threatens our water security. Experts agree that the combination of rapid population growth, pollution, the destruction and mismanagement of freshwater resources, and the failure to study and anticipate climate variability will create a growing water security challenge. I was talking to someone the other day, I can't recall the figures, but the person said that at least 50%, I couldn't believe, I have to validate these figures, of our population don't have access to clean potable water. If it's 100 million, so 50 million Filipinos don't have access to clean potable water, mag-iigib, magpapakulo. that is a deprivation of our basic human right to clean, potable water. At the root of this water shortage is a deterioration of our country's forest areas. As you know, under nature's order of things, watershed areas store water for release into our water receptacles during the dry months, ensuring a continuity of water supply. Yet most of the proclaimed watershed areas have been classified as deteriorated or dying. As chair of the Environment Committee in the Senate, I've been hearing their budget as vice chair also of the Finance Committee for Environment. And we realized that of the 113, I think, protected areas in the country, areas which have not been demarcated, hindi pa namomohon, and because Congress, we have not passed the final forest limits for forested areas, and so there is a problem of encroachment of informal, illegal settlers in areas which are considered forested or in areas which are considered under the NEPA's law as protected areas. So the need for us to have an enabling legislation for 113 protected areas so that they're actually demarcated and protected, and the need for the final Forest Limits Act, which I filed way back in 1998, which has not yet been enacted into law, is essential so that we're able to determine which of these areas really should be guarded, protected, and conserved. According to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, of the country's 15.8 million hectares, 7.2 million hectares are forested. Climate change threatens our biodiversity. Philippine forests, host to a large variety of plant and animal species, have been declared as one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. If global mean temperatures exceed 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, 30% of all species will face a high risk of extinction. Climate change threatens our energy supply. In 2010, if you will recall, Typhoon Bashang in the Visayas paralyzed the energy sector. It also caused a massive blackout in Luzon. This only shows how vulnerable energy-related infrastructure are, and thus a call for the need to climate-proof our energy sector. The measures for improved management and development of our energy generation, our transmission, and distribution linkages must therefore be put in place. Climate change, as I mentioned earlier, threatens our economic growth. Based on the study by the Asian Development Bank on the economics of climate change, the country stands to lose 6% of our GDP annually by 2100 if it disregards climate change risks. However, this same study found that if the Philippines invests 0.5% of its GDP by 2020, not far from now, in climate change adaptation, it can avert losses of up to 4% of its GDP by 2100. Clearly, this is a short-term investment with a long-term eightfold gain. Climate change, clearly, after having explained all that, threatens our right to life. A 1-meter rise in sea level would inundate an estimated 129,000 hectares of land, affecting 2 million people. The warming climate aggravates floods, droughts, super typhoons, and they regularly strike us with their attendant savagery. All of this kill people, destroy property, upset our own production and planting schedules. They undo all the development gains. And I think it was Lucille who said in our hearing, while we have had an increase by 1,000-fold of the budget of flood control budget and flood control infrastructure, but it's actually just rebuilding, right? Is that what you said in the hearing? Rebuilding from what was lost or destroyed, brought about by extreme weather events. We should welcome it if there's an increase in our budget for infrastructure, if it's to fortify areas which are not yet affected. Kaya lang it's rehabilitate at reconstruct nung mga nasira na. And so that is not a good mark for our development. Ang ating investment nilalagay pag nasisira lang. There must be an engineering shift in terms of how we must do this so that our limited resources can be focused not just on rebuilding what was lost, but on building and fortifying areas which could be vulnerable as well. Given these far-reaching implications of climate change, we clearly have good reasons to be concerned about this issue. In terms of legislation, we have enough laws, policies needed to help us build communities that are disaster resilient and adaptive to climate change. I can just give you a rundown of the many laws already available, and you can actually access them on the website. The Philippine Environment and Impact Statement System, the Marine Pollution Control Law, the Clean Air Act, which we authored way back in 1999, the Clean Water Act, which we authored in 2003, the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law, my baby, RA 9003, I'll talk to you about it later, the Renewable Energy Law, which is so important, the Environmental Awareness and Education Act, the Climate Change Act, which created the Climate Change Commission with Vice Chair Sering and President Aquino as a chair. We have 2 other commissioners, which is mandated, as she said, to do the National Action Plan, to also help local governments in their local action plans. The sister agency of the Climate Change Commission is the NDREAMC Council. I'm sure you mentioned that earlier, brought about by our Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Law, which is the OCD. The Office of Civil Defense under the DND, Department of National Defense, is a secretariat of the NDREAMC Council, which was born by the NDREAMC law. So with Lucille in the Climate Change Commission and her partner, supposedly, the NDREAMC, the head of the OCD, they should help each other because climate change and disaster risk reduction should follow the same direction. They should help each other. And we also had the hearing just yesterday with the OCD, which is a secretariat of the NDREAMC Council. We have a Toxic Substances and Hazardous and Nuclear Waste Control Act, and the act creating the People's Survival Fund, which is the funding mechanism of the climate change law. Because the first time the climate change law was enacted, I had this funding mechanism, but the People's Survival Fund came much later. So the number of environmental and climate change laws is no guarantee for effective action. In fact, the UN has lauded the country's laws on climate change and disaster reduction as the best in the world. However, the UN also noted that the challenge is to translate national policies, plans, and programs into local action with measurable gains. It is now more than 12 years ago since the Solid Waste Management Act was enacted, but the NEDA noted that in 2012, only 9 out of the 17 LGUs in Metro Manila have submitted a solid waste management plan, and only 414 of 1,610 LGUs nationwide, or 25.7%, have complied with the national plan. We need to ask why some LGUs can comply while others cannot. We need to understand what enables action, since only through effective enforcement that these laws gain their true meaning. But there are good LGUs that actually comply. Camotes Island in Cebu, San Francisco, the recipient of a 2011 Sasakawa Awardee of the UN ISDR for their Purok system, where they developed the discipline needed in proper waste management. They actually segregated waste at source, recycled and composted, no trash segregation, and no collection policy. The other one is Hinatuan in Surigao Sur, that's your region. Maybe you know this better. I don't know if that's the same mayor, but they just did simple, the clogging of canals, they cleaned their surroundings, etc. They were the 2010 Zero Basura Olympics champion. We can look also into the experience of a small town in Iloilo, Alimodian. Well, some barangays saw fissures and they followed the geohazard map. To make a long story, linikas ng mayor noon ang mga tao, nung nagkaroon ng bagyo at gumuho, walang namatay dahil siya ay sumunod. So, these are simple, basic, doable things. Barangay Andap, for example, in Compostela Valley, kung alam lang nila na purple yung area ng barangay na yon sa New Bataan, sa Comval, bago man dumating ang bagyong Pablo nung panahong yon, dahil hindi naman sila sanay sa Mindanao ng bagyo, ay sana hindi linikas doon sa barangay na yon, barangay hall, ang mga tao at hindi kailangan namatay kung ang Mines and Geosciences Bureau ay napamahagi ang ating mga pag-iintindi ng geohazard map hanggang barangay level. So the biggest challenge in the fight for a climate and disaster-resilient nation is really to build LGU's capacity to implement our laws, bearing in mind the preferential priority for proactive measures. That's why I ask the MGB, DNR, the OCD of the NDRIMC Council, and Secretary Sering of the Climate Change Commission to work together so that we will have not only regional but provincial up to barangay DRR CCA workshops to engage our people to understand and implement doable laws that we have done. And we know that disaster impact should be evaluated in public investment planning from the national to the local levels. It is imperative for the government to submit to the discipline of disaster and climate risk sensitive development planning. We must also encourage private companies to come up with their own business continuity plans so that business affected by disasters can resume operations in the least amount of time. We can enjoin the media, which you are doing now, to actively assume their social roles, which is actually what you're doing in the Social Good Summit, as public conscience, development educator, change driver, as enhancing public awareness and knowledge as a key to building a culture of safety and resilience. In every disaster, there is a huge opportunity to change the mistakes we've made in the past as an opportunity to move ahead. This will require a new level of commitment and collaboration among government agencies, LGUs, the private sector, media, civil society. Let us start with concrete, doable actions. Sabihin nyo, ano bang pinagsasabi ni Loren? Ano ba ang kayang gawin? Simple po, clean our drainages, segregate garbage at source, clean our rivers. Kung sino ang mayor, sagot mo ang basurahan sa lugar nyo, sagot nyo ang ilog nyo, sagot nyo ang iyong waterways at esteros. I'm doing helping in the implementation of the Supreme Court decision on the cleanup of Manila Bay. I know that it is a gargantuan task, but we intend to meet with the head of the task force designated by the Supreme Court, that's Justice Velasco, with the 13 agencies that have a budget to clean up the bay. That's a different story. I see my wrap-up sign here. That's not part of my speech. I just wanted to tell you about that. Ano pa ang pwedeng gawin? Plant and grow more trees. Sabi na, ginagawa na yan, but plant more trees and really stop all forms of cutting. On every vacant lot, plant trees. Set up rainwater catchment basins so water is stored during the rains and used during the dry season. Update our dam protocols dahil marami ang namamatay pag tulog ang tao at nagpapalaya ng tubig na wala naman early warning na sapat sa mga tao na nandun sa downstream. Remember, ang mga dam na ito ay hindi dapat kalaban ng tao dahil ang mga dam ay dapat makatulong para magkaroon ng enerhiya, magkaroon ng tubig at irigasyon. Hindi para makapatay ng tao kung hindi updated ang ating mga dam protocol. We must also relocate, that's political will, our urban settlers living in vulnerable places to safe and livable areas. The forces that threaten our people and the development of our country must be met with resolute will and sustainable solutions. Strong political will at national and local levels can help bring about the big change we want to see. Reducing disaster risks, adapting to climate change are highly important to the world now, especially to developing countries like the Philippines, where disaster risks abound, and to the poor and the marginalized who are most affected by disasters, our indigenous people, our urban settlers, those who live in vulnerable areas. So the issue before us today cuts across age, gender, ethnicity. Without a united front against disasters and climate change, we could do little to minimize the risks. So now is a time, I think, where we should redefine what development actually means. Does develop mean a 7 or 8% growth GDP, or the quality of life where vulnerabilities are actually lessened and risks are actually lessened? And so on that note, I leave you today. I guess we still have question and answer, but what I'd really like to do was for us to actually assess what development actually means. Is it just double-digit growth statistics, but the quality of life of our people? We're suffocating from the pollution of our cities. We're actually living with the stench of the base, and ang mga lawa, ang ating mga ilog ay marurumi at pinapabayaan lang natin na ganoon. ang ating mga factory ay nagpo-pollute at bina-violate ang ating Clean Air Act na nandyan, pero walang bahala ang tao. Ang segregation ng garbage ay pinapatupad lamang ng 1/4 ng ating LGUs. Ang climate change action plans ay hindi pinapatupad dahil maraming dahilan kesa walang pera, etc. So we must really analyze what development actually means. But deep in my heart, I think that we must look at development bearing in mind the quality of life of the poorest and the most vulnerable populations. Thank you very much for listening. Good morning.